So today, Mitzvah Hashem, we begin a new chapter, a new dimension of Kodshim in our overview of Kodshim, and that is the Kodshim dimension of Yom Kippur. And we begin with Prisha, which means that the Mishnah at the beginning of Masechta Yoma establishes that before 7 days before Yom Kippur, and presumably on the 3rd of Tishrei, the Kohen Gadol has to leave his home and take up temporary residence for a week's time in a lishka called the Lishkas Farhedrin, which is in the Azara. And we once discussed, when we talked about the Azara, the various lishkos, what the status of the Lishkas Farhedrin is. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll come back to review that as we do so. Now, the main question that we have for today's learning is the source and the basis and the purpose for this Prisha. Why does the Kohen Gadol have to leave his house for a week prior to Yom Kippur? And we begin with the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is standing on the shoulders of Tanoim that came before him. And that opinion was that we derive Prisha of the Kohen Gadol 7 days before Yom Kippur from a different Prisha that took place in the Mishkan with regard to the Mishkan, and that's called the Shivas Yemei HaMiluim. And the Kohanim had to leave their homes and take up residence in the Ohel Moed for 7 days before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which was the day in which they began the Avodas HaKorbanos. So in preparation for the Avodas HaKorbanos that would begin on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the Kohanim took a week in which they left their homes and they took up residence in the environs of the Mishkan for a week's preparation in which they prepared for the Avodah of Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan quotes a brisa, an anonymous brisa, that reflects that shita, that we derive the Prisha of the Kohen Gadol from the Prisha of Aaron and Banav during the Yemei HaMiluim, that for 7 days before they began the Mishkan work on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which was the 8th day of the Miluim, but that 7-day period, the Torah says, Upasach, Upesach, Ohel Moed Teshvu, Shivas, Teshvu Yomim Halayla Shivas Yomim. And that pasuk is at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. The Torah commands the Kohanim, in this case Aaron and Banav, to leave their homes and take up residence Yomim Halayla Shivas Yomim. And the Ohel Moed was the place where they were at for 7 days of Miluim. And now Rabbi Yochanan and the brisa before him presents a hekesh between the Avodah of Yom Kippurim and the Avodah on the 8th day of Miluim on that first day of Hakomas HaMishkan. Where is this hekesh to be found? And the pasuk says, "Kasher asa b'yom hazeh tziva Hashem lasos lechaper aleichem." That just like you did it for this day, I've commanded you to do the same for the day of lechaper. What does lechaper mean? And Rabbi Yochanan says that we darshan the word lechaper as a reference to the Maisa of Yom Kippurim, and that just like they were commanded in Prisha for 7 days of Miluim, so too Lidoros, down the line, there is an obligation of Prisha before the Avodah of Yom Kippurim Lechaper to be Poresh for Shivas Yom. Ad Kan HaKofa Alf. This is the view of Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish has a different view, and we'll try to understand the nafkamina between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, and he quotes a brisa of Rabbi Yossi Aglili as support, that we don't derive Prishas Kohen Gadol Shivas Yom Kodshim Yom Kippur from Yemei HaMiluim, but rather from Moshe Rabbeinu in preparation for going up and receiving the Torah. And it says, according to a principle that Reish Lakish is going to derive from Moshe Rabbeinu, is that kol hanichnas lemakom hashras hashchina ta'un prisha. He needs prisha to be separated from his wife before he enters into a makom hashras hashchina. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim will enter into the Kodesh Kodshim. That's a makom hashras hashchina. And therefore, he, the Kohen Gadol, before Yom Kippurim, needs this prisha in preparation for his encounter with the Shechina in the Makom Hashras Hashchina. And this is based upon Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu was Ton Prisha. He needed Prisha. And this is the parsha of Moshe Rabbeinu ascending to God. And this was a Prisha that Moshe Rabbeinu required before he went into the Makom Hashras Hashchina. Now, the Gemara says it depends on how you interpret the psukim that Moshe Rabbeinu was entering into the Anan, and that mist, that cloud, was I guess you'd say, a physical manifestation of the divine Shekhinah. Okay, now Moshe Rabbeinu needed Prisha, and now we're going to apply the principle not of Gzeira Shava or Hekesh, as we did in Rabbi Yochanan's favorite reference, but rather the principle of Bameh Matzinu. And we analyzed it. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu need Prisha? Is because he was going up to Hashem, and he was going to receive the Luchos on the seventh day after his Prisha began. And we're going to learn from Moshe Rabbeinu opinion of Bameh Matzinu, just like Moshe Rabbeinu, before he climbed up Lifnei Hashem in the presence of the Shekhinah to receive the Luchos, he needed a preach of 7 days or 6 days plus, because on the seventh day already he received the Luchos. So too the Kohen Gadol, who after 7 days of preacher will enter into the Kodesh Kodshim and have, so to speak, an encounter with the Shekhinah in the Kodesh Kodshim. Now, if we accept Reish Lakish, then we ought to come to the conclusion that, like Moshe Rabbeinu, the Kohen Gadol needs to preach of 6 days. Because again, on the 7th day, Moshe Rabbeinu already received the Luchos, so his preacher was only 6. How then, according to Reish Lakish, can we derive by virtue of this Bameh Matzinu that a Kohen Gadol has to be parish 7 days before Yom Kippur? So the Gemara says that the last day, the extra 7th day, is an independent takonas chacham. So as far as the Torah is concerned, the Prisha, the Kohen Gadol, could have been 6 days, and that would have been enough. And on the 7th day, he goes into the Kodesh Kodshim. That's fine. That's what we've derived from Moshe Rabbeinu. But the Rabbanan added an extra day. Why did they do so? They were afraid that if, let's say let's start with Yom Kippurim and count 7 days backwards. Now, if 7 days backwards before Yom Kippur, he doesn't need preacher because he only needs 6 days. The Chachamim were worried that if he has an intimate relationship with his wife 7 days before Yom Kippur, and he's poresh the following day, which is 6 days before Yom Kippur, to fulfill this Doraisa requirement that we've derived from a Ben Maksin, from Moshe Rabbeinu, of 6 days of preacher, then if his wife, heaven forbid, was a nida, again, unbeknown to anyone, at that moment when he had intimate relations, then he will be what's called a boel nida, and he's tameh, and therefore he is disqualified from doing the avodah. By adding an extra day, you guarantee that after 7 days, again on the side that he was boel and nida, after 7 days he could be tovel b'mikvah, he could be mitayr himself, just like a nida after 7 days on a deraisa level could be mitayr herself, and he's he's suitable for the avodas Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Choshishu chachamim shemiyavo al ishto v'timtza nida b'shas bia nimtza tamei shivas yom k'dira bol nida arei eno yochel lava b'Yom Kippur ulefichach tiknu lafrisho mibeisa, 1 extra day. By adding that extra day, they guarantee that even if he had a relationship with his wife right before the 7-day period began, he would have 7 days, and it turns out that she was a nida, he would have 7 days passing of Tumas Bal Nida. He could go to the mikveh that very night and start the avoda of Yom Kippur. All right, in the footnote, he just tells you where you will look this up. Now, just 1 second, I'm looking for, where does he write? Oh, okay, there are a few things that I wanted to share with you. I'm just looking, okay, we still have 5 minutes. Let me point out to you that there's an afkamina between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, meaning between Yemei Miluim and Moshe's preacher, in terms of the exact hour that the preacher has to begin. According to Rabbi Yochanan, that we derive Prisha of Kohen Gadol from Aaron Ubanim v'Yemei Miluim, then the Prisha would be 7 days before Yom Kippur, clearly, and that would be on the 3rd of Tishrei. If that be the case, then he could be poresh on Gimel Tishrei at any point during that day. It doesn't have to be the beginning of the day, right? The halachic day begins with Lila, correct? And we okay. And if we needed a full 7 days of Prisha, he would have to be Porish at night on Gimel Tishrei, so that Gimel Tishrei itself is a full day of Prisha, the first kickoff of 7 days. But no, we don't need that. Why? Because with regard to counting any sort of sphera of a melos, we apply the principle of Mixas Hayom Kikulo. So that if he was Poresh on Gimel Tishrei before nightfall, 23 out of 24 hours of Gimel Tishrei was not Poresh, then it's fine. Why? Because we can count Gimel Tishrei as the first of 7 days of Prisha via or through the halacha of Mixas Hayom Kikulo. However, if we accept Reish Lakish and we need Prisha of 6 days, just like Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai was Porish 6 days, and we added a 7th day for the Nida problem, to cover the Nida problem, then if Boel Nida has the same identical status as a Nida, the Tumas Nida is now, so to speak, I mean, not transferred, but also is cloned onto the Boel Nida, And just like a nida cannot be toveles until after the 7 days, and we're going to count miyom liyom, yes leis, from, on the clock. There's no mikvah yom kikulo. The earliest time a woman could go to mikvah after her nidus, again, this is all on a deraisa level, is leil shmini, going into the 8th day. So therefore, if he starts his prisha on Gimel Tishrei in the middle of the day, he will not be able to go to the mikvah 7 days later. Even though on the counting you could say mikvah yom kikulo, but mikvah would be an impossibility because he's a boel nida. And one last point I wanted to make, such a fascinating subject. He says, according to Reish Lakish, why did Moshe Rabbeinu need prisha litochanan? The Gemara explains, because of the pasuk that says v'gilu bir ada, and Chazal darshan b'makom gila sham tehei ra'ada. Now, what's that all about? In the case of Yemei Luim, I understand they needed 7 days to prepare for the avodah of Rosh Chodesh Nisan. There was a constant training over and over again to learn all the laws of what a Kohen has to do in his avodah. But in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, why did he need this prisha of 6 days? And the answer is for a mental state. We're not talking about training. Moshe Rabbeinu is not doing any training here. But for a mental, emotional state, which is called in the Gemara's language, ra'ada. Now, once Moshe Rabbeinu reaches the top of the mountain and he has an encounter with the Shekhinah, that's simcha. That's gila. That's an exhilarating experience to be in close proximity with the Almighty. But the Torah tells us, the pasuk in Tehillim says that you need ra'ada in order to achieve simcha. So if you anticipate that you're going to be having an encounter with the Almighty, you need ra'ada to put yourself into a very serious mood in preparation for the encounter with Shekhinah. And in the Gemara's language, that's called la'ayim olav, like spook him out, scare him, to be in a heavy solemnity state. Lavdilo, this is a lashon of Rashi, lavdilo mipnei adam, they should tachalo love ema. He should have that awe. Biyoso levado, when he's alone. This is the source for what's called his bodedus, if you've ever heard of that. Biyoso levado, when he's alone and he has left his family. Yosim levavo, he can focus. Mikones lemachne shchina bi'ema. So he enters into the encounter with God in a state of fear, of awe, and that same halach applies to the Kohen Gadol in preparation for his great meeting in the Kodesh Kodshim with the Shekhinah. The Yeshmin Achronim Shenachtu B'Shitas HaTosfos Shegam preaches Kohen Gadol Nitreches Mitam Zel Lefisha Kodesh Kodshim Havi Makom B'Shras Shekhinah Hu Makom Gila Shenemar Oz V'Chedva B'Mkomo. In the Kodesh Kodshim there's only Gila. Lefisha Nitreches Bo Ema Ura Ada. He needs Ema and Ra'ada to prepare himself for that great moment of Simcha, for that great moment of Chedva Bimkomo, and the Oz, which means a solemn attitude, a serious, heavy state of awe, is all in preparation for Chedva Bimkomo. And that's the point from the Gilu Bir'ada. So the Kohen Gadol needs Ra'ada during this time of Prisha. Again, it's 6 days of Ra'ada and Ema before he can enter into the Kodesh Kodshim and have this encounter of Chedva and Simcha, because the Torah says V'gilu Bir'ada, and you need Ra'ada before Gilu.
What is Ema stage before Hadar?
That's what we'll have to. I tried to press the mute button, but I don't know how to do that. So, okay. So now we will go back to our sugya in Masechta Pesach.